with the Climate Reality Project to become a climate reality leader. And so what I've done for our time together today is pull some of the slides that Al Gore uses in doing his presentations around the country and probably around the world as well, and weave in some slides that are more related to environmental justice and racism, which is what the thread that you all wanted to, or I say you all, in conversations with Donna in particular and Robert, wanted to focus on. There was a lot of, just because of the times that we were in or are currently in, the climate reality training had a lot of focus on environmental justice as well this time out. So I have beta tested what I'm doing, and hopefully this will not have some of the glitches that we've all witnessed during these times of virtual connecting. So let's see how this goes. Can you all see that? First slide? Good. So as it would happen, I don't know how you all selected the first or the second Sunday in August for this, but it happens to be International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. So just wanted to tag that. All of our, if you've been to a Presbyterian meeting lately, we start out each Presbyterian meeting with what's referred to as a land acknowledgement. And so that's acknowledging that we live on the land of the Catawbas. I've got an app on my phone that I can go in and type in a location, and it's called Native Land. In case any of y'all are interested in downloading that app on your phone, you can go on an internet and do the same thing with the internet site. But this slide shows the range of the Catawba Indians at one time. So goes up. I'm a native of Roanoke, Virginia, so it goes across the border into Virginia, south of Roanoke, takes in a good part of South Carolina, including the area where the Catawba Reservation is currently located. Goes, looks like pretty much over to 95 in the eastern part of the state, so east of Raleigh, and west to as far as Asheville, where beyond that would have been the land of the Cherokee Indians. So this part of the country has been settled by indigenous peoples going back 12,000 years. I can't expect you to read the fine print on this. This is a picture that I took of a sign on top of Moore Mountain in Moore Mountain State Park, acknowledging the first people. And part of the park is in the process of expanding as a settlement with the lands owned by Alcoa. The park's going to increase considerably in size, and it's going to take in a site known as the Hardaway site. There's been extensive archaeological work done there, and so based on that work, we know that they were native people in this area going back 12,000 years ago, so 10,000 BC, that lived in the area. We've also got further east, still in the bounds of the Presbytery, Town Creek Indian Mound near Gilead, North Carolina, which was a mound, as the name indicates, ceremonial mound. Those folks, the folks that lived there, go back about as far in time, so 10, 12,000 years back in history. This slide is just to remind me to do a disclaimer. So this is the desk that I'm sitting at. This desk was my parents both were public health workers, and they worked for the health department in Virginia. At one time, they were modernizing their office, moving whatever, and so they had surplus furniture, and so my parents ended up with 2 desks, and I now inherited those desks. They're made out of oak. They're made, maybe getting a little bit ahead of myself in the presentation, but I'll probably forget by the time I get there. So I'll just go ahead and say that these desks were made by prison labor in Virginia. So when you start looking at issues of justice, there's a lot of talk now about the pipeline to our prisons and how you've got disproportionate populations of Black inmates in our prisons. And historically, these inmate populations have been used to perform labor rather, with little to no wages, essentially the same type of enslavement arrangements that go back to the earliest days of African-American settlement in this country. Folks brought here to do labor for colonists on plantations. So, and it's all not always obvious the ways in which we're complicit in structures that foster racism and injustice. These structures are deeply embedded, and we've gotten used to them, so much so that now the term we use is the term woke, to learning again about how these relationships are affecting our lives, and how we can easily become complicit in problems. And I'm trying, there we go. Sorry. Got ahead of myself there. I have been fortunate as a number of leaders in the Charlotte area, in the Presbytery bounds, to listen to voices of minority voices, listen to voices of Black and Indigenous people of color talking about, among other things, the environment, and learning from them. C.N. Jenkins Memorial Church in our Presbytery hosted a national gathering of the Green the Church Summit. This is an annual event that takes place. You see Jerry Cannon there. You see Otis Moss, who's a UCC pastor in Chicago, was Obama's pastor when Obama was in Chicago. We, as part of that event 3 years ago, did some tours in Charlotte. This is pictures taken at the Mel's Place Garden in the west side of Charlotte, in an African-American community. This is a project where young African men learn about agriculture, and this is an immersion experience. These young men, they take routine trips to Africa, to Ghana in particular. I don't know if they go to any other countries or not, but helping these young men learn more about their heritage, as well as about a relationship with the land. So a lot of this structural, systemic and structural racism, as it relates to how we interact with the land, a lot of times the justification for those relationships among people and with the land goes back to the Bible, through sometimes misinterpretation of it. So I've pulled out 2 verses, both from Genesis. These are 2 different threads that are in Genesis, from the first chapter of Genesis, the verse 26, and I put it in the King James because it uses the word dominion. And God said to us, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. That word dominion is probably not the best translation for, and I don't even remember the Hebrew at this point in time on that, but there's a thread through Christianity, and not just Christianity, but other faiths as well, of us, the earth being ours to do with what we want, and discounting the verse from the Psalm that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. One of my favorite verses in the entire Bible is the account in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, and I used the Young Literal Translation, which is a version I don't use very often, but I used it because I like the way that they translate one of the Hebrew terms. So it reads, and Jehovah God taketh the man and causeth him to rest in the garden of Eden to serve it and to keep it. Bill Brown, Old Testament scholar at Columbia Seminary in Georgia, translates those words as it reads here, to serve, and actually he says preserve creation, but the word serve is a translation of the Hebrew abad. Other translations that are more common would use words like work or till or cultivate. I like the word serve. It's a little less transactional to me. I don't remember the first time I set foot in Davidson College Presbyterian Church. I could probably still count on my 2 hands the number of times that I've been there over the 30 years that I've been back in North Carolina. But one of the times early on that I was there was when you all had Frederick Buechner come in as a speaker. This is my absolute favorite Frederick Buechner quote. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. The verse from Genesis 2:15 is, I just heard that verse quoted recently in one of the webinars I was on, and the person that was quoting it was making the point that, is a point that I often make as well, that that's really the marching orders for all of us. So whether we're butcher, baker, or candlestick maker, what we do needs to be tied back to our role as creators with God, and making sure that everything that we do serves and preserves creation. And we're off to the races this year. This news just came out a few days ago. They're looking at the possibility of 24 named storms this year. If they exhaust the English alphabet and they don't use the last 3 letters of the alphabet, then they'll have to go to the Greek alphabet. So this has made the news. Many of you probably heard this news in recent days. They're looking at 5 major hurricanes, and those of us that live in North Carolina know what kind of responsibility that puts on us as a state to be prepared as a coastal state. You only have to think back to some of the hurricanes in the last couple of decades, and the impact that they've had on the state, and in particular the impact that they've had on poor minority communities. So the problems that Princeville in the eastern part of the state went through with the hurricane, when all the hog farms were also flooded out. Mentioned earlier the greening the church conference that came to Charlotte, Davidson College. Some of you may have gone to this lecture. I did not get a chance to go here to this lecture, but Davidson College several years ago brought in Dr. Robert Bullard, who, as you see there, is commonly thought of as the father of environmental justice, to talk about climate change as a human right and why equity matters. Essentially the same conversation that we're having today. So weaving together the thread of how over time, back to the earliest days of European American settlement in this country, have run thinking about the ways that the first European Americans related to the land and the peoples that were already living in the land. We have those romanticized stories about the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving. And I say romanticized because that's exactly what they are. One of the things that we've done, so Robert mentioned I'm currently the moderator of Presbyterians for Earth Care. It's the national organization. We do a biennial conference. So the last two conferences that we've done, the one in 2017 was in the Columbia River Gorge on the Oregon side. And then last summer, actually at this very time in August, we were at Stony Point in New York. Both times one of the offerings for our workshop time was a blanket exercise that was designed by the Kairos Project. The one at Stony Point was led by Irv Porter, who's our Native American staff person with the denomination. He actually it's a part-time appointment, so he's also a pastor out on the West Coast, but he led this story. This is from a press release that Presbyterian News put out. You can see there that as that blanket exercise progresses, the story of European settlers taking land from and killing indigenous peoples told, and the blanket area becomes smaller and smaller. So those folks are standing on blankets and they're representing Native Americans. And, for example, the diseases that were brought by the European Americans as they came in were easily caught by Native Americans who had no natural immunity to those diseases. And so there were lots of deaths from disease alone that reduced the number of people living on the land. And then land was also taken continuously and treaties broken and so forth. So this is more quotes from that press release. And the press release ties this into the doctrine of discovery, which goes back to a papal bull issued, I think in the 1500s, which is where a lot of the attitudes came about that were brought to this country by the European Americans coming here, that this was land that folks had every right to seize and take as their own. Throughout the world, there are indigenous populations that are still trying to defend their land against illegal occupation, illegal takings. This report from a year ago in The Guardian, which was reporting out a study that appeared in the journal Nature Sustainability, talks about how the killings of environmental defenders have doubled over the past 15 years. This is as it says here, similar to what we experience in war zones around the world, that there are more people that have died in these assassinations than have died in the Afghan and Iraq wars over the last 2 decades. And the last part of that quote talks about environmental stresses on the land as capitalist developers move into new areas to do mining, to do farming and other extractive uses of natural resources, not focusing on sustainability. During the recent virtual General Assembly of our denomination, the Saturday during that virtual assembly, folks were encouraged to take part in the virtual Poor People's Campaign March on Washington. Back when we were still planning for an in-person assembly, there were plans to bus people from Baltimore, the location for the General Assembly this year, and bus them into Washington for that march. I don't know how much you all have followed the Poor People's Campaign. They do have an active chapter in Charlotte. I was just on in a virtual meeting yesterday with that group. So they've taken Martin Luther King's original tenets for his campaign and the systemic racism, poverty, and the war economy and militarism, and they've added to that also ecological devastation. William Barber, along with Liz Theo-Harris. Liz is a ordained Presbyterian minister. For those of you that don't know, they're the co-chairs of the Poor People's Campaign. They keep stressing the importance of having a moral imperative and a moral narrative for getting our nation back on track when it comes to overcoming systematic and structural racism and the related problems that we're facing. And all these injustices, as we all know, have intersected over the last 4 months with the Black Lives Matter movement, healthcare with COVID, and our presidential elections that are coming up this fall. So again, and this is a quote from the Poor People's Campaign, they're tying this back into the doctrine of discovery, and so that we all understand where the marching orders for the way that we've been doing things originally came from. And tied into that would be the whole concept of manifest destiny as well. Presbyterian Disaster Assistance funded, as you can see, some of you may know about this already, a documentary called Flint, The Poisoning of an American City. Slide here of the director and a staff member at First Presbyterian Church in Flint at a screening of that movie. Water is one of the resources that's just absolutely critical to our existence. And we're hearing now with how severely impacted the Navajo Nation has been by COVID. There's so many people that live on the Navajo reservation that don't have access to clean water, which makes sanitation, it makes it difficult, if not impossible, to take sanitation to the levels required as we try to deal with COVID in terms of washing hands more frequently. I've got a couple of slides in here that may not thread in real well with the train of thought, but I was thinking as I was putting this together about the context with Davidson. the town of, and the namesake who died in the Revolutionary Battle of Callens Ford, and thinking about our early Presbyterian ancestors who were so involved in the American Revolution, which threw off the yoke of colonialism from Britain. But we know that, I'll just stick with that slide for a second. You know, Latta Plantation is not that far from Davidson, so we did have a plantation economy in this part of the Piedmont at one time. Caldwell Presbyterian, where I'm a member, has done, we did our 100th anniversary celebration less than 10 years ago, about 10 years ago. And in the process of researching the history of the church, realized that the money from that helped the church get established from the Caldwell family, which is why it originally the name was Caldwell Memorial Presbyterian Church. That was money that was acquired through a plantation economy. And so in the wake of the events of the last several months, John Clegger, our pastor, preached a sermon in the last month or so calling on session to look at whether or not we want to rename our congregation, much in the same way that Queen's University renamed the administration building because of the fact that the person that the building was named after had been involved in the enslavement of peoples at one time. There's Dr. Robert Bullard, who came to Davidson College several years ago as part of a panel that did a presentation during the recent training for the Climate Reality Project, along with a Native American, an African American woman, and a Latino man. Just in terms of some of the disparities, in my ministry has been more of a dual career ministry. So my paycheck for the better part of my career came as a public servant. I started out working in water quality, and then more broadly with natural resource conservation, also as an environmental educator. So you look at how marginalized populations interact with the environment, and it's there's a lot of elitism that gets attributed to European Americans. There was a report on public radio recently about John Muir and some of his racist attitudes. John Muir came from a Presbyterian lineage out of Scotland. We also had in recent months the incident in Central Park in New York with a black birder being accused of a white woman of threatening her. And so there's this whole phenomenon of birding while black that has been a topic of a lot of conversations recently. So this is an environmental educator that did a presentation under the auspices of the Museum of Natural Sciences here in North Carolina, an African-American woman talking about parks and green space inequity in marginalized communities. As one of the things, I'm backgrounds in forestry, and so I'm very much aware of what trees do for us. Certainly in terms of climate change, they're a sink for carbon. They help cool our urban areas. There are studies that show that crime is lower in areas that have green space. Students do better on standardized tests when their school grounds have lots of green space, when there are trees outside the windows of their classrooms. Unfortunately, marginalized populations often live and go to school and work in areas where there's less green space and less recreational green space. This is fine print's way too small for even me to read sitting at my laptop. As the presbytery wrestled with racism several years ago in the wake of Mr. Scott's fatal shooting in Charlotte, all the teaching elders within the presbytery were strongly encouraged by the presbytery to attend a dismantling racism workshop. I went to the one that was hosted, a 2-day workshop hosted at C.N. Jenkins Presbyterian Church. Some of the best training that I've been to, but it focused its on how structural racism permeates so much of the way that we do things in our world. And similar to the blanket exercise, part of that workshop led us going back to the very beginnings of European American history in this country, and how racism has been inherent at every step of the way, and how a lot of these events never make it into history books. So it started with the interaction with the indigenous populations that were here from the earliest times of settlement by European Americans. It's a press release that came out 2 years ago after a General Assembly in St. Louis, talking about how not only Presbyterian Church USA, but other denominations began to repent for the ways in which native lands were seized. Don't know how much you all know about Jeff and Autumn Michael in your congregation, and the things that they do Monday through Friday. I first got to know Jeff when he was the executive director of the Land Trust for Central North Carolina, before he went on to head up the Urban Institute at UNC Charlotte. This is an article that they published online about prairies in the Southeast. I'm very well acquainted with a prairie here in Cabarrus County that the oral history, has accounts of that prairie going back to the time of settlement, which is back around in the late 1700s, 250 years ago. And this article was about that prairie. The picture there is showing the native blue stem grasses and other grasses that are growing in that prairie, just to give an idea of how much impact we've had on the landscape. So a lot of the plantation economy in this part of the world in the Piedmont would have been cotton. So enslaved peoples would have been helping to manage row after row after row of cotton. And in the eastern part of the state, it would have been tobacco. But these European Americans destroyed, in a lot of cases, the natural biodiversity that were in the areas that they moved into, and created monocultures of single varieties of crops. And that still haunts us. I mentioned earlier when we had the hurricane that slammed the eastern part of North Carolina not too long ago and flooded the hog farm. So, North Carolina's #2 in hogs. And so we've come in and put all of our eggs essentially in one basket when it comes to animal agriculture in those kinds of settings. And at this point, Trying to think. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So let me kind of wrap up here. I wanted to mention Eva Clayton, another Presbyterian. Eva was longtime congressman representing her district in the eastern part of the state. She's a native of Warren County. Warren County is infamous for dumping of PCBs, illegally dumped PCBs. These are chemicals used in electrical transformers. They were, when they were reached the end of their useful life, they had to get rid of it. And so the trucks were just spreading this stuff on road shoulders at night. Very toxic chemical. And Eva led the way on calling out the injustice of picking a county that was rural and high percentage of blacks that lived there. So the county was targeted for getting rid of these chemicals. Eva is a lifelong Presbyterian, has been honored by Presbyterian women with their annual award, is now living in retirement back in that area and is a member of Cotton Memorial Presbyterian Church. But Eva is a pioneer, a trailblazer when it comes to environmental justice, both in North Carolina, but also on the national scene. Another website screenshot from the Presbyterian Church USA's website dealing with environmental justice and racism. After the General Assembly in St. Louis 2 years ago, there was an overture that was adopted and is now policy on environmental racism and justice. I just wanted to run through what that policy calls for. I think there's some folks on the call that aren't doing the video probably, so I'm just going to read through these. Renew our denomination's call to promote environmental justice and oppose environmental injustice in all its forms. Take action to respond to environmental racism and environmental justice in all its forms, including A, to provide educational resources to churches and mid-councils about environmental racism and injustice. And secondly, to provide information and resources to enable the buildings and operations of our churches to be more environmentally sound. You all know about this through your Earth Care congregation journey. To listen to perspectives and voices of people most impacted by environmental racism with awareness to cultural diversity, domestically and internationally. And finally, in accordance with the gospel, to petition the church's approach to environmental problems to include responses to the voices most directly impacted by environmental racism. Again, from the Climate Reality Project, nearly 40 years ago, communities of color in the United States launched an environmental justice movement as a response to environmental racism and inequity of environmental protection. Today, the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19, recent acts of police brutality, and the continued threat of climate crisis to the frontline communities have renewed the call for justice and human rights in the United States, with Black and Brown communities continuing to lead the way. This was a promo for that webinar that I posted slides from earlier. Webinar was to deal with an opportunity to hear from climate and environmental justice leaders to better understand the history of injustice in the U.S. and the way forward in the fight for climate and social justice. Another webinar that I was in on recently gives a definition of environmental justice. The one they used was the intersection of hazardous waste cleanups and building climate resistant communities. And for this location in Georgia, they were listing Superfund sites that were there in that area. Another definition: environmental justice is a clear place where social justice, environment, hunger, and poverty come together. So I am going to stop the screen sharing and open it up for questions at this point.
Thank you, Dennis. Appreciate you sharing all that information. Let me see what questions are out there about what Dennis has shared, or any other issues that relate to the topic. You can just unmute yourself and ask away, or type it in the chat, either way.
I have a question. According to the policy that was stated in like 2018, it was a call for a lot of action. Dennis, can you tell us some things that the church, the PCUSA at large has done, or local efforts to combat environmental injustice, or any of the things you've been talking about in line with that policy statement that was made at the General Assembly?
Yeah, from the vantage point that I've got, it's they're taking a very across the board approach to things. When my wife and I came back from Pakistan in the late 80s, we had a chance to participate. I had a chance to serve on as a consultant to a task force that brought a recommendation to the General Assembly in 1990 that became what is still the seminal policy statement for the church. And part of the way that they did that was approach that was to look at all the different areas of the church, the way the church was structured at the time. So they were looking at the educational and the mission and, you know, mid-level judicatories. So one of the things that I'm aware of to do these conferences that the Presbyterians for Earth Care does every other year, we do that through the generous grant from the Presbyterian Hunger Program. So just a couple of months ago, I did the grant application for the conference that we're going to be doing in 2021, which right now is probably looking like a virtual conference. But just in the grant criteria, they are, they were looking at the board, for example, and, I was cringing the whole time I was working on that, because the board of the organization that I serve on is all white. Most of us are retired in some shape, form, or fashion. We don't reflect, I don't even think, the diversity of the denomination, and certainly don't reflect the diversity of the population. So the Hunger Program is using those dollars to leverage encouraging, incentivizing groups that receive those funds to reflect the world that the church is working in and doing mission in. That's just one example that I can think of. Another example, and it was in, as I was looking back at the response of the denomination to repudiating the doctrine of discovery, the language in that overture even talked about churches doing, their own version of reparations. So giving back land to the native peoples that were there. So last year when we were in Stony Point for our conference, Stony Point Presbyterian Church had just gotten, the membership had dwindled to the point that it was not a going, viable concern as a congregation anymore. And Rick Ufford Chase, who along with his wife is co-director of Stony Point Center, worked through the presbytery in that part of New York to get that church property donated to the Ramapo Lenape Nation. So it is, that was in the works when we were there for the conference. So later last year, that the presbytery actually took that vote. So that property, the building and the land, is going to become a cultural center for the Ramapo Lenape Nation. In my mind, we had an opportunity to do that in the Presbytery of Charlotte when we decided we no longer needed Fellowship Point on the Catawba River up in Iredell County. So that land could have been, and I don't know, I was not on the group that made the decision, but it wasn't reported out at the Presbyterian meeting that one of the considerations was to give that land back to the Catawba Indians. But those kinds of things are happening. I think, you know, it's different depending on what level you're talking at around the denomination, whether you're talking about a local church, and you all probably have examples from Davidson that you could share with me. But I've seen, you know, different things are happening at different levels.
Thank you. What other questions? Dennis, as you go ahead, Linda.
Yeah, I just wanted to hear more about, I'm interested in the campaign for the Poor People's Campaign as something that blends morality and politics. And it seems like there's a good movement going there that we could join in and be effective, maybe more so than if we were trying to start something ourselves. But I don't know that much about it. We've heard about it, but I mean, in terms of just getting involved, I was just wondering what your sense of that campaign is and where you've seen that that's a way to go or not.
Yeah. So after retiring early several years ago, I knew I wanted to spend a lot more time in advocacy. I had a lot of constraints on what I could say and do as a public servant. So Poor People's Campaign was something that I got involved in more immediately. So the ways that I've gotten involved, before COVID, I was going to local and state gatherings. There's like I said, there's a chapter here in the Charlotte area. They, Caldwell Presbyterian Church has hosted some of their meetings in the past, which I've attended. They also were doing moral, well, as an outgrowth of the Moral Monday actions that Dr. Barber was organizing in Raleigh. I guess it was 2 summers ago. They were doing actions every Wednesday, as I recall, in Raleigh. So I went down for a couple of those actions on the mall. I followed them on social media. I zoomed in to the virtual March on Washington last month. Presbyterians for Earth Care has gotten involved with them and signed on as a co-sponsor. There are different levels at which you can get in. The other thing I'm thinking about, so Dr. Barber brought Al Gore to North Carolina to focus on the ecological devastation part of the Poor People Campaign agenda last year. And so I drove to Goldsboro for a Sunday morning service at Dr. Barber's church. And then the following Monday evening drove up to High Point, I believe it was, or Greensboro, where Al Gore spoke again. And those meetings were organized around the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. I don't know how much you all followed that. It recently was announced that Dominion Energy and Duke Energy had decided to mothball plans for that project. But there were, again, the routing of that pipeline was being routed through low-income rural communities where people were presumed to not have enough voice to speak out against it. North Carolina Council of Churches was a very vocal in their opposition against the pipeline, and like I said, ultimately it was overturned. I think the big push right now, certainly one of the major emphases with the Poor People's Campaign is voter registration, and making sure that folks are registered to vote and have minimal to no obstacles to vote with that election coming up in less than 3 months. I mean, obviously you're on this meeting today, you've got a computer, you know how to use it. I'd say going to the Poor People's Campaign website and looking around there and finding some ways to get involved in some of the things that are going on. I get a lot of my cues too, just by following the emails and different things that are coming out from the Presbyterian Church. Jimmy Hawkins with our Office of Public Witness in Washington has been very involved in Poor People's Campaign work. And so there's a lot of stuff that comes out of that office about ways that the Presbyterian Church and Poor People's Campaign are partnering together. And as I mentioned, the co-director, Liz Theo Harris, is an ordained Presbyterian minister.
That's helpful. Thank you. I just was trying to see where the Presbyterian Church was going in relationship to that. So it sounds like there's already activity in that direction.
Oh, yes, very much so.
Dennis, what are ways that we can, I know you worked on this some, ways that we can connect with others in our presbytery to strengthen the witness and the voice of those concerned about these justice issues?
So one thing that's coming up, and I can send this information out, going into the General Assembly in St. Louis 2 years ago, I brought an overture from Presbyterian New York passed an overture, adopted an overture on calling on the denomination to categorically divest from fossil fuels. That was ultimately voted, it was voted out of committee, recommended to the General Assembly, but was ultimately not approved on the floor of the General Assembly. And so there was an initiative underway again this year at the General Assembly to bring that resolution back. And then as the General Assembly shifted from in-person to online, those of you that follow General Assemblies at all know that was, we came up with we ended up with ultimately doing a virtual General Assembly. And so the business part of it was drastically abbreviated. So only essential business, what was deemed to be essential business, was taken up for consideration. So Fossil Free Peace USA, which is a program now of Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, previously was under the auspices of the Presbyterian for Earth Care. They are pivoting and taking a two-pronged approach to call on mid-level judicatories to divest any funds that they have in fossil fuels, and are similarly calling on folks that are invested in the Presbyterian pension program to consider shifting their investments within the pension program out of stocks. So there's a webinar that's coming up on the 19th of August. I can, if any of you'd like to join me on that webinar, would love for you to do that. At this point, I have no idea what kind of investment funds, if any, the Presbyterian of Charlotte has in fossil fuels. But we're trying to get on the front wave. It's already now cheaper to, energy is cheaper from solar and wind energy. So clean energy is cheaper than fossil fuels derived energy. And some of you may have seen in the news recently that BP made an announcement in the past, I think actually in August, so in the past 9 days or so, made an announcement that they're shifting away from fossil fuels in the near future. So in the next, starting now and over the next decade, expect to make significant progress. But so at the Presbyterian level, it may even be that your own church has its own investments, and there might be some ways that you could have some leverage there. I know Presbyterians for Earth Care is doing a monthly webinar for Presbyterian Earth Care teams. We're working on bringing together a virtual Presbyterian Earth Care team in Charlotte. So I would welcome, Rosemary was in on that call, the last call a month or so ago. Donna, I think you may have checked in on that one as well. But there are things that we can do by working together, a lot of them related to issues of justice, climate justice, racial justice, environmental justice at the Presbyterian level. So would welcome any of you that want to join in on those efforts as well. Just let me know about that. 2 ideas of many.
Thank you. And Dennis, one thing that you can do following this is if you have a resource list, I can that you could send to me of ideas where people can connect and get further information. I can forward that to the group, and people can do some more of their own research and exploring.
We're working on getting more information on the Presbyterian website, and I can send you kind of a working version of that, kind of like an advance copy.
Great.
Glad to do that. Thanks for asking.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions today for Dennis, or comments that folks would like to make?
Sir, I would like to make a comment, please.
Yes, go ahead.
So my name is Fahad Firdausi. I'm new to the church. I just would like to. This is just because it's relevant and it's contextual. Very recently, I don't know if anybody saw this discussion that Mr. Elon Musk and Mr. Bernie Sanders were having on Twitter about, and this is commentary about how investments are made and how there seems to be a weird lopsidedness effect of how investments are made in our sort of current system. And maybe this get taken up on a more structural level to address how investments are made in the long term. So the discussion was about how Mr. Sanders proposed that there should be a one-time tax to Mr. Musk, where he would pay, I think, $27 billion in taxes. And Mr. Musk replied that, well, Mr. Bernie Sanders was being a socialist. And to which Mr. Bernie Sanders replied saying, well, Mr. Musk would not have accomplished what he's accomplishing without the support of the federal government in the tune of billions of dollars. And at that point, if you see the discussion changes from Mr. Musk, where he shifts the conversation saying, well, this is the same thing that the oil lobbyists have been saying, and they have been extracting trillions of dollars of funding from the federal government, which may be true. However, the way the system currently, and what is to be noted is, and I'm not supporting any of these any political candidate or anything, I'm just making conversation about how this is structured. In sort of the pure, I'm an entrepreneur, I float out stock, I started this company, so I should, bear the fruits of all of it, I think is an inaccurate and a fundamentally inequitable way of structuring windfalls from necessarily multi-generational shifts in people's behavior. So if we shift from oil to solar, it should not mean that somebody like Elon Musk as an individual person just gets to profit from it in a lopsided manner, just because he was able to secure the funding, be able to convince investment bankers to support his kind of company. Sure, there's a lot of hard work that goes into it, and there's a lot of innovation that's happening. But to say that, oh well, that socialist sort of mindset, or to say that it's the same sort of rhetoric that comes from oil lobbyists. It is not. What is being said is that there's an incorrect profiteering that is going on, and I fear that if this is not addressed structurally, it will continue going on. So the Presbyterian Church will invest in, say, a Tesla or the like of that sort of investment. That sort of investment will be able to get federal support because there's a groundswell to switch from, say, fossil fuels to solar, and it benefits this one individual. So when these investments are made, what I'm saying is when these kinds of investments are made, they should be structurally looked at, how the structure of these investments are made so that they don't just profit one individual in a lopsided manner. Thank you.
So I think that, the circles that I move in, there are lots of people. Just one example would be all the state chapters of Interfaith Power and Light. So people from a faith perspective that are looking at, getting us to a clean energy world, are working hard to make sure that it's not just the yuppies and the NIMBYs, not in my backyard crowd, that benefit from that, that people of marginalized communities, people of color, are able to benefit from new energy technologies as well. I mean, that's part of the justice piece, is making sure that that's part and parcel of those initiatives. One of the tools that I'm hearing a lot about, Citizen Climate Lobby is another group that's focused on, right now, focused almost solely on trying to get legislation passed that would create a carbon dividend tax, so that, now when you burn fossil fuels and you have air pollution and water pollution that result from that, and carbon going into our atmosphere, as well as coal ash problems that we're all too familiar with in this state, the dividends would increase over time and be paid back out to the American people, but by putting a higher price on the true cost of generating and using fossil fuels, it would over time create an added disincentive to that. and they're making some traction. I mean, that there are a number of different approaches that people are taking to getting us where we would be, but the idea of the distribution from the carbon dividend would be one that everybody would benefit from, much like the stimulus payouts that we got a few weeks ago. It's just one tool in the tool chest, but just looking at all the different ways that we can treat climate justice as an urgent, not just an important, but an urgent issue, deserving of our attention, and getting to carbon neutrality sooner rather than later, because we are getting perilously close to the point of no return on that. And it's hard as a part of a political process, and that's what you're alluding to with, Sanders is wanting to be very assertive, if not aggressive, on addressing these issues. And as the Democratic platform is being formulated with Biden, there are efforts to try to get, Green New Deal, I guess, is the big talking point right now. And it does get that label of socialism placed on it. I know all too well, working in the realm that I've worked in as a public servant, it's, I've got to be very careful, had to be very careful in how I worded my conversations. And the training that I've had with Blessed Tomorrow and with the Climate Reality Project, both really, get those of us that have had that training in a mindset of finding points of connection with political leaders of all different persuasions. And usually it's around, their grandchildren or a place that they love, if they like to fish, or if they, birding and gardening are two important hobbies, but talk about how the way that we're living is impacting these things that we love and the world that our children will inherit and our grandchildren will inherit, and trying to get beyond typical landmines that we can easily step into and find ways to have productive conversations. It's a complicated issue for sure, and how to have those conversations. That's a whole nother webinar right there.
I'm just going to respond by saying, Mr. Testerman, thank you so much. That was a very sort of gentle and kind guiding response to me, and certainly insightful about how people are more responsive to particular ways of discussing the topic versus others. I think, and sort of to go back to the point of helping people and communities that are underserved or have fallen behind, or my point is to say, and not to take anybody's side, but there's the disincentivizing fossil fuels, but there's also, so that drives the behavior into incentivized clean fuel, and to make sure that as we are incentivizing that behavior, the windfalls from that sort of change somehow structurally also reaches these underserved communities. That could be a great way to help these communities participate in that new growth as the behavior changes on the other side. Thank you. That's my response. And I really, again, thank you very much for kindly guiding me.
Thank you for the question and for that discussion.
Thank you both. I'm gonna ask if we can wrap up. It's about 5:15 almost, and we might see if there's any last comments or questions, and if not, I'll ask Dennis if he wouldn't mind offering a closing prayer for us today. Anybody else? Heather, as chair or co-chair of social, anything you want to say about anything coming up to this group?
Sure. Thank you, Robert. And also, thank you so much, Dennis. This has been incredibly insightful and interesting discussion. I would like to let everyone know that we will hold a regular monthly meeting, which will be August 30th, I believe, our last Sunday of the month. And I will be sending out more information about the Matthew 25 congregation. Some of you, I believe, were on the ABC Bible study call that we had with Reverend Jimmy Hawkins. And Reverend Hawkins was very supportive of congregations joining the Matthew 25 movement. And we have talked about that within our committee, and in conversation with Marcia and Robert, we think it would be a good time to bring up a recommendation, if we so choose as a committee, to recommend to the session that we proceed with that designation. So I will be sending out more info to you all, and then we would meet on the 30th and discuss and decide where we want to go from here. So that's my announcement.
Thank you, Heather. Dennis, thank you so much for taking your time to share with us about your work and helping to inspire us to continue our work. And we look forward to being in touch and hopefully connecting with others in our presbytery as we continue to engage in these conversations and seek ways to be more faithful in our work of environmental and racial justice. So we appreciate, again, your time and look forward to maybe getting a few resources from you that I can share with the group and with others in the congregation. So thanks again. And if you would offer a closing prayer, it would be wonderful.
Sure. And as a segue to that, two parting slides. The first one is just to keep on all of our radar screens that we're only maybe 3 weeks out from the season of creation, which starts on September the 1st and runs through the feast day of St. Francis on October the 4th. And there's a website that's got resources on it. There's a lot of good stuff that's been prepared for that observance this year. So I encourage you to look at that. And then if I can there we go. So not only is it Indigenous Peoples Day, but it's also Smokey the Bear, annual Smokey the Bear Day. So this is a poster that I had on my wall of my dorm room during college as a forestry major. Thank you for listening and speaking out today, and for all the ways that you're involved. Let's close with a word of prayer. Creator God, you have placed us in this big, beautiful world that is both, well, as I said, it's beautiful and it's also bountiful. And we give thanks this day and every day for all the hands that labor to bring our food from the fields and the oceans to our tables, ever mindful that it's an imperfect world and that while there's enough for everyone's need, not everyone has enough because of the greed of some. So we pray that we can always be vigilant and look for ways to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Help us to see you more clearly, to love you more dearly, and to follow you more nearly day by day. And all the people said, Amen.